From Ballen Studios in Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please crawl inside of the Follow Button's bed and feast on several crunchy granola bars, and then without cleaning up, just remake the bed. This episode is called Hunger Games. On a late August morning in 2014, a 37-year-old graduate student named Zara Valentine stepped into a university building in Boston, Massachusetts. It was the first day of classes, and there was a big welcome event for all the new students. Zara was anxious, but also excited. After working for years in human resources, she decided to finally return to school and complete her PhD. Zara wove her way through the crowd to the sign-in table. She grabbed a name tag, then went into the main hall, where her new classmates were clustered around tables, meeting one another and enjoying some refreshments. But as Zara looked around the room, she couldn't help but notice that she was one of the oldest people in the graduate program. She'd always been a good student, but she'd attended college a long time ago. And so Zara suddenly worried she may not fit in with her much younger-seeming classmates. Zara took a deep breath and steadied herself. She knew it didn't do any good to get rattled on the very first day, but just then her stomach rumbled. She had been so focused on the new student orientation this morning that she had forgotten to eat. Zara made her way to the buffet table, took a plate, and loaded it with some snacks, just as the Dean of Students walked on stage. Zara listened to a speech about the noble journey of higher education as she snacked furiously on mini sandwiches. Zara waited until the Dean ended his talk before going back for seconds. One morning, a few months later, Zara sat inside of a lecture hall typing notes into her laptop as her professor went over the latest assignment. All of her classes so far had been inspiring, but also mentally exhausting. Her program covered a lot of ground quickly, and she was determined to keep up. As Zara's fingers flew across her keyboard, her mind was suddenly distracted from her professor's voice by the sound of people whispering. Zara stopped and glanced around her to see who was doing it. But the students in the row behind her had their heads down, taking notes too. Zara turned her attention back to the front, but minutes later, the whispering behind her started again. This time, she spun around much more quickly to catch the gossipers in the act. But it was the same students as before, still just totally absorbed in taking notes. They barely even noticed Zara. Zara stared at them, watching their eyes and hands as they typed. She wasn't sure, but something about their behavior made her feel like her classmates were just pretending to take notes, that they had been whispering and this was all just a ruse. Zara did turn back around to her laptop and did her best to try to reconnect with the lecture, but now she couldn't focus. She was far too anxious to pay attention. Later that week, Zara was walking back to her apartment near midnight after a long study session at the library. On the corner of her street, she approached a neighborhood market. Despite the late hour, a couple of people were browsing the bins of fruit out front, while a few others were inside buying groceries, and a clerk stood behind the counter listening to the radio, looking bored. Zara knew she didn't have much to eat back at her apartment, so she went inside. Zara walked along the aisles looking at pastas and breads and condiments when a strange urge suddenly gripped her. She took a box of crackers off the shelf, pretending to read the back of it, and then slipped it into her backpack. She glanced at the clerk, but he seemed to be totally oblivious, still just listening to his radio. An electric thrill suddenly flickered through Zara's body as she realized she had just gotten away with shoplifting. She tried to play it cool, but she didn't want this feeling to stop. So Zara drifted over to a different aisle and slipped a fancy mustard into her pack too. And after that, some expensive chocolate. She almost laughed at how easy this was. Her brain was buzzing. By now, Zara's bag was feeling heavy with all her stolen items, so she made her way towards the entrance like she had looked around but, couldn't find what she wanted, and then as nonchalantly as she could, she walked back out the door onto the street. And then once outside, she strolled casually down the block, and then when she was out of sight, she gradually sped up until she was full on running. Nobody came after her though, and so Zara was consumed by this feeling of total euphoria. She had never done anything like this before. Back at her apartment, Zara spread out her haul on the kitchen counter, and seeing it all there was kind of surreal. It was amazing, but also at the same time, she was starting to feel kind of disturbed, like she couldn't believe she had done this. And then Zara's euphoric high kind of came crashing down, and she suddenly wondered if she should just take all this stuff back and apologize. But she didn't, and so she just kind of sat there with her feelings, wondering what had come over her. She had never stolen anything before, but it was like tonight some other personality had taken her over. A few weeks later, just before the school went on holiday break, Zara was back in class taking notes during another long lecture. Her mind raced as she did her best to keep up. Just then, she heard a familiar murmuring behind her. Zara tried to ignore it and stay focused on the professor's words, but the voices behind her got louder. Zara whipped around to scold whoever was being so rude, but when she did, everyone near her had their heads down, typing or writing. Nobody was making any noise. But the situation made Zara's blood boil. Here she was doing her best, while other students who clearly didn't care were disrupting the whole experience for everybody else and then pretending they weren't as soon as she looked at them. So Zara decided she was going to stop this behavior today. Enough was enough. The last time her classmates had interrupted, Zara had let it slide, but no more. Just because she didn't catch them in the act didn't mean they weren't whispering. She knew what she had heard. And not only that, she was positive they were whispering about her. Whatever they were saying, Zara felt like she deserved to know. And so, with a loud scraping sound, Zara, in the middle of class, abruptly stood up from her chair. The professor heard the noise and stopped talking and looked right up at her. And soon the entire lecture hall was turned towards Zara. Zara stared back, scanning the eyes of all the students and the professor, trying to figure out who had been whispering this whole time. Their blank gazes irritated her. They all looked guilty, but Zara refused to be intimidated. She told the whole class in a loud, angry voice that she knew what they were up to. They could keep trying to hide it, but she knew they were playing a game and she was sick of it. Zara almost pitied her classmates, how trapped they were in their characters, reciting staged dialogue and acting out their assigned roles. It was all so blatant. She couldn't stand another second of it. Zara snapped her laptop shut, scooped it into her backpack, and stormed out of the classroom. The winter streets of Boston were cold and gray as Zara hurried back towards her apartment. She was eager to get home and away from all these people she couldn't trust. But as she ran down the hallway of her apartment building and approached her unit, she froze. Her front door was already wide open. Moving slowly in case there was an intruder, Zara tiptoed to the doorway and peeked inside. Furniture was knocked over, books and clothes were scattered everywhere. The place had been ransacked. Suddenly it hit her. Zara felt like a fool. Of course she'd been robbed by her own parents. She'd given them her spare key, and they must have come while she was at class. Zara knew they were in on the same game as all of her classmates and even her professor. Zara couldn't tell what her parents had stolen, but she was not about to let them get away with this. First, Zara deadlocked her door, and then she began surveying her apartment. She had a feeling that her parents had not only robbed her, but had also contaminated the place with some sort of poison. She rummaged through drawers and cabinets, looking everywhere, when her eyes suddenly landed on the refrigerator. Zara went into the kitchen and slowly opened the fridge door. Her groceries were still there where she had left them, but she knew something was off. Zara leaned in and smelled. Then she jumped back and slammed the fridge shut in disgust. She'd have to throw away all her food because everything inside of it had clearly been poisoned. Zara then picked up her phone to call her mother, Antoinette, and after a few rings, her mother answered. And Zara told her mother that if she or her dad ever came anywhere near her apartment again, Zara would hurt them. If they wanted this to get ugly, Zara wouldn't be the one to back down. Then she warned her mother to never call her again, and then Zara hung up. 1 month later, on a drizzly winter morning in February, a psychiatrist named Dr. Jonathan Lean prepared to meet with Zara at a Massachusetts psychiatric hospital for the second time. Their first meeting had been 1 month earlier when Zara had arrived at the hospital, accompanied by her very shocked parents and some social workers. By the end of that very first visit, Dr. Lean had helped Zara realize that the world was not out to get her. Instead, she was clearly having some sort of mental trouble and really needed professional help. And so Zara had actually agreed to check herself into that hospital for a full month of inpatient psychiatric care. Dr. Lean diagnosed Zara as suffering from a psychotic disorder, which is a serious mental condition that causes a person to have trouble staying in touch with reality. He put her on a regimen of antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medication and ordered extensive blood tests. The blood test results revealed that Zara was not getting enough of several key nutrients. She was also anemic, which is when someone doesn't have enough healthy red blood cells to carry oxygen to the body's tissues. Anemia alone can make a person's behavior erratic, although very rarely to the degree that Zara had shown. Nevertheless, after that first meeting, Dr. Lean had prescribed Zara a variety of vitamin supplements to combat her anemia, along with the other drugs to help with her mental disorder. And so now, after a full month of care was finally done, Dr. Lean was eager to see how Zara was doing. Tomorrow was her final day of inpatient treatment, and Dr. Lean was hoping that his prescriptions had helped her get back to her usual self. Right on time, there was a knock at the door, and then Zara entered and took a seat. Dr. Lean's heart sank when he saw her. Zara looked as frail as when she'd arrived. Her skin was pasty and pale, and her hair looked thin and scraggly. Dr. Lean asked Zara how she was feeling, but she just shrugged. She promised she'd been taking all of the vitamins and all the medications that he'd prescribed her, but Dr. Lean wondered if she was actually telling the truth. It didn't make sense to him that the meds wouldn't have any effect. Dr. Lean was very disappointed, but he had worked in psychiatry long enough to know how incredibly complex mental health really is. Patients respond to treatments at very different rates, and it might just take a bit longer for Zara to feel the effects of all of these medications. And so, Dr. Lean congratulated Zara on sticking with her treatment for the full month as promised, but told her that the next day her parents would be coming to take her home. He said he hoped that Zara would keep taking her medications until she fully recovered. Zara nodded blankly and stood to leave. As she did, Dr. Lean reminded Zara that she was always free to call him if she ever needed help, but Zara was already out the door and did not appear to be listening to him. The next day, Zara's mom, Antoinette, held her husband Robert's hand as they walked across the parking lot and into the lobby of the hospital where Zara had been staying. A receptionist at the counter told them that their daughter would be down soon. A few minutes later, Antoinette heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. She turned to see a nurse pushing Zara out in a wheelchair. Zara looked gaunt and exhausted. Antoinette rushed to give her daughter a hug, and when she did, her daughter's body felt like a bag of bones. Antoinette tried to be grateful that at least her daughter seemed calm, rather than hostile like before. She hoped this was maybe the first sign of improvement. Maybe her old self would return once she was settled back at home. Robert grabbed Zara's bag while Antoinette led Zara out of the building towards their car. But the drive home was very strained. Antoinette, at one point, tried to make conversation by asking Zara how the food was at the hospital, but Zara just shrugged. She said she hadn't really eaten much while she was there. Antoinette shot a worried look at her husband behind the wheel, and then a moment later, Zara told her parents that the doctors had all been gossiping about her, and the only way to stop the game was to stop eating, so she basically threw away most of her meals. Most days, Zara said she limited herself to a slice or two of bread and some water. Antoinette felt crushed. Zara's delusions had obviously not changed at all. She didn't know what to do or even where to turn for help. Eight months later, a primary care physician named Dr. Maggie Portis was studying Zara's file a few minutes before Zara was set to arrive for her appointment. Zara's story really intrigued Dr. Portis. Zara did not drink alcohol, she had never suffered a head injury, and she had no family history of mental health issues. And yet, she'd spent a month at a psychiatric hospital for delusional behavior without showing any signs of getting better. According to her family, her delusions were still as strong as ever. Since being released from the hospital, Zara had gone to a number of doctors who determined that she had a vitamin deficiency as well as a thyroid issue. Zara was given supplements to boost her iron and vitamin B, and her thyroid issue was treated successfully. But none of those treatments had any effect on her mental health. She was still totally delusional. While Dr. Portis was lost in thought, a nurse notified her that Zara and her mother were waiting for her in an examination room. Dr. Portis headed down the hall, eager to meet her new patient, But the moment she entered that exam room, she was struck by how hollowed out and desperate Zara looked. Dr. Portis introduced herself, then had Zara undress and step on the scale. Zara weighed only 99 pounds, despite being 5 foot 6 inches tall. Dr. Portis then had Zara sit on the examination table, while a nurse came and tied Zara's arm with a tourniquet, swabbed an area with an alcohol pad, and filled a syringe with her blood. Zara seemed to barely notice any of this. After the nurse left the room, Zara complained to Dr. Portis that she had been taking all of her prescribed vitamins and medications, but did not feel any better. Dr. Portis nodded. As Zara talked, the doctor suddenly had a hunch about why Zara was not getting any better. If her hunch was right, then of course Zara's meds wouldn't have had an effect, and her delusions would continue. Choosing her words very carefully, Dr. Portis told Zara that she thought she knew what might be causing her mental problems, but she wouldn't be able to tell for sure unless Zara had a procedure done. Zara's eyes lit up at the idea, and she immediately agreed to do whatever it took to make a change. She said she just wanted her old life back. Dr. Portis felt deep empathy for Zara. It was clear that she was afflicted by something that she really had no control over. Dr. Portis wrote down a name and a phone number on a notepad and handed it to Zara. She explained that it was contact information for a doctor who could perform a biopsy, which is a surgical procedure where tissue is removed from the body and then examined under a microscope. She promised Zara the procedure would be quick and painless, and it might bring her closer to solving her health issues. Zara clutched the piece of paper with both hands and thanked Dr. Portis. Then she sighed and leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and went limp with exhaustion. Dr. Portis wished Zara luck and then left them to have a moment alone. 2 weeks later, on a cloudless morning, a gastroenterologist, which is a doctor who specializes in diagnosing and treating diseases and conditions that affect the digestive system, named Dr. Simon Reed, shook his head in amazement as he surveyed the biopsy results of a patient's small intestine. In all his years in medicine, he had never seen a case quite like this one. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and Zara entered. She looked thin and very nervous. Dr. Reed thanked her for coming in and told her to take a seat, and then he asked her how she'd been doing. Zara looked away from the doctor and out the window and then down at her hands. She told the doctor she felt like her real life was behind her now. She used to feel like she was just entering a promising new chapter, being back at school to finish her PhD, enjoying her own apartment in the city and thriving in her studies. But then everything just kind of went off the rails. She started doing these weird impulsive things without understanding why. It became hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. She couldn't trust anyone anymore either, like her parents. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't even trust herself. Dr. Reed was moved by Zara's story. He could tell that she was desperate for help, but didn't know where to turn, which was why he was so happy to be able to be the bearer of good news. He told Zara that her primary care physician, Dr. Portis, had been smart to tell her to go get a biopsy, because it led to the breakthrough Zara had been looking for. The tissue sample they had taken during the biopsy showed that all of Zara's physiological and mental symptoms were being caused by the same condition, and best of all, it was treatable. Zara would only have to make one life change, altering her diet. At the word diet, Zara's body froze. She narrowed her eyes and squinted at Dr. Reed like she was trying to read his mind. He recognized it as the paranoid behavior detailed in Zara's file. She suffered from the delusion that basically everyone was lying and no one could be trusted. But Dr. Reed promised Zara that he really was telling the truth, that this was the only way for her to get better. If she changed her diet, the delusions she was experiencing would go away. If she didn't change her diet, her delusions would only get worse. But the look on Zara's face told the doctor that she was not buying any of this. She scowled at Dr. Reed and shook her head in disgust. Then she got to her feet and moved to leave, but then stopped by the door and turned back around. She pointed a finger at Dr. Reed and accused him of being part of the game like everybody else, another traitor and liar trying to trick her with food. She told him that she wasn't going to fall for it, and then slammed the door and stormed out. Dr. Reed just sat there motionless, unsure what to even do. He was completely stunned by what had just happened. Several months later, on an overcast spring morning, Antoinette Valentine huddled in the front seat of the family car next to her husband, Robert. She felt a sense of dread hanging over them. Antoinette looked out the window at the familiar silhouette of the state psychiatric hospital, a sight she had seen too many times lately. But she hoped today would be the last. Her daughter Zara was finally being released following a court-ordered 3-month confinement. After storming out of Dr. Reed's office 6 months earlier, Zara's life had totally unraveled. She stopped picking up phone calls or checking in with anybody. She failed to fill out the forms necessary to continue her PhD program. She quit paying rent on her apartment and soon got evicted. And before long, she was wandering the streets. Antoinette had not heard from her daughter in months until she had showed up at the family home, banging on the door in the middle of the night, acting completely erratic and strange. Antoinette tried to calm Zara down, but there was no reasoning with her. Robert had no choice but to call the police, who handcuffed Zara and took her away. Later, after Zara made more threats against them, Antoinette and Robert filed a restraining order against their daughter. Weeks after that, the phone rang in the middle of the night, and Antoinette immediately had a bad feeling. It was a nurse from a local emergency room with news that Zara had attempted suicide. She had been found alone and unresponsive, but fortunately, medics had been able to revive her. Since Zara's mental state was extremely fragile, she was being transferred back to the state psychiatric hospital, and so that was 3 months ago. But today, finally, Zara was being sent home. Antoinette took a deep breath, braced herself, and held her husband's hand as they walked into the lobby of the hospital. The receptionist told them that their daughter would be out soon. Antoinette could not stop pacing around the lobby as they waited. The last time she'd seen her daughter, Zara had been violent and disturbing. Antoinette worried that when she saw her daughter again, she would still be emaciated, or that she'd scream and throw a fit and refuse to go home. Antoinette's memory of their last encounter was still a fresh wound in her mind. But just then, there was the sound of footsteps, and Antoinette spun around. It was Zara, and she seemed like her old self, the one Antoinette remembered before all this started. Zara was clear-eyed and smiling sweetly, like she really was seeing her parents for the first time in a long time. Antoinette couldn't believe it. She rushed to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her, and this time it felt like there was actually something there to hug. Zara was a healthy, normal weight again. Zara even hugged her mother back. Antoinette stepped back and looked her daughter up and down. She was speechless. Zara had this beautiful outfit on, and her skin had a healthy glow to it. Antoinette couldn't believe such a huge mental and physical transformation was possible in just a few months. What was even more amazing was that Zara's transformation was the result of something so simple. For the past 3 months, Zara had been eating only particular foods prepared by the hospital, following the recommendations made by Dr. Reed 6 months earlier, the one who suggested Zara change her diet. And now Antoinette saw proof that Dr. Reed had been right all along, just by looking at her healthy daughter smiling right in front of her. Zara's incredible improvement was entirely due to the fact that she stopped eating foods that contained gluten, a protein commonly found in foods like bread, pasta, pizza, and cereal. Dr. Reed had discovered that Zara suffered from celiac disease, which caused her body to have a severe reaction to any foods containing gluten. Though many people are diagnosed with celiac, often as adults, Zara's condition was the worst doctors had ever seen. Zara's immune system attacked the gluten that she ate so fiercely that it damaged her small intestine. Over time, her intestine became too inflamed to absorb vitamins or iron, no matter how many supplements she took. That's why she was so anemic and thin. But even worse, gluten triggered inflammation in Zara that didn't just affect her intestine, but also her brain too. In Zara's case, inflammation caused her brain to misfire, resulting in delusions and psychosis. She starved herself intentionally and became wildly suspicious of the people around her while starting to commit crimes herself. Not because she wanted to, but because it was like her brain was malfunctioning. But once Zara started a gluten-free diet, her inflammation subsided and the delusions were gone. Antoinette and Robert were ecstatic to have their sweet daughter back. The drive home from the hospital that day was one of the happiest in their family's history. Zara was affectionate to her parents and seemed very grateful to be thinking normally again. Zara understood now that gluten really was to blame for her life spiraling out of control, and so now all she wanted to do was make up for more than 1 year of lost time with her parents. Unfortunately, though, their joy as a family was very short-lived. A few months after Zara came home, Zara accidentally ate some food that contained gluten. Her delusions returned, but this time far more intensely. Once again, Zara became convinced that her parents were plotting against her, and this time she wanted to do something about it. Driven by her paranoid hallucinations, Zara went to her parents' house and tried to kill them. Thankfully, police arrived before anybody got hurt, but Zara was sent to jail. Unfortunately, we have no information on what happened to Zara after that, but her and her family's life has been forever damaged. All because of a little protein found in a slice of bread or a plate of pasta.
In 1974, Jean-Claude Romand enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend, and shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. His wife would proudly tell her friends that her husband was a super doctor who worked quietly in a neon-lit lab in Geneva to develop all these incredible treatments. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect, but looks can be deceiving. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luc, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident. In the night, a boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. The 2 men had been friends for nearly 20 years. They were both doctors, they both got married at almost the exact same time, their kids had grown up together, and now Jean-Claude's family had been completely destroyed. Later that day, when Luc arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room, barring anyone from going inside. And when they realized Luc was his best friend, the policemen said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you about Jean-Claude?" And so Luc was confused, but he walked over and sat at a table with the 2 officers, and they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1970s, but he failed to show up for his first-year exam, and without passing that exam, you can't advance in medical school, and so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years. All the while, he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies, and eventually he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would drive around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center and would just walk around the lobby and read pamphlets before going home again. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel, stay there for a couple of days, and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was a UN employee. And because he's this very successful, reputable doctor, people agreed and gave him their money. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money, and he didn't have it. And so some of these people began doing some research on Jean-Claude, and they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization's staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And to this point, he has been living this lie for almost 20 years. His wife, his kids, his friends, his parents, everybody, he has told that he's this successful doctor, and that's all about to come crashing down. And the way he handles it is he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life. And so after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence. But in 2015, he became eligible for parole, and in 2019, he was released. On September 6, 2006, 51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen was returning from her job as an emergency room nurse in Portland, Oregon. On the way, she stopped at a hair salon to get her hair dyed. While she waited her turn, she picked up a magazine and a particular quote stood out to her. It said, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." At the time, Susan was fighting with her husband, Mike. They had been married for nearly 18 years, and their marriage had become toxic, and Susan had finally gotten the courage up to tell Mike she wanted a divorce, and Mike did not want a divorce. And so they had these bitter, awful fights, and Susan was just looking for things to latch onto, and this type of quote gave her motivation to follow through with this very difficult decision. About an hour later, with her hair now a slightly different color brown, she hopped back in her car and drove the last couple of miles home to her quiet little neighborhood. She pulled into the driveway of her one-story Cape Cod home with their gray picket fence around it. She went in the back door into their mudroom, and right away she saw a note next to the microwave that her husband had left, because at this time they were still living together. And the note just said, "Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days." She put the note down and then unlocked the door that led into the house, which was into the kitchen. And as soon as the door opened up, she heard the beeping sound of their security alarm. And then she walked all the way through the house to the front door. She unlocked it, went outside, and then checked their mail, and then went back inside the house. After she got back inside and had shut and locked the front door behind her, she kicked off her shoes and then began walking across the house towards the kitchen. She got about halfway there when she looked over to her left, and she noticed the first floor bedroom that they used as a guest room was really dark. And every morning before she left for work, she would open all the curtains around the house. And so in the evening, the sun would come into the house and it would be nice and bright. And so she's thinking to herself, did I forget to open the curtains in that room? Because it shouldn't be that dark. And as she's staring at the room, a man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He was medium height, medium build. He had a hat pulled down over his eyes. He had yellow rubber gloves on, and he was holding a hammer. And he began walking right towards her. For many people, the sight of a stranger inside of your home carrying a hammer would be enough to prompt you to turn around and run out of your house. But not Sue. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years. And in that time, she had done things like crack open people's ribs to massage their hearts. She had administered IVs and thrashing patients that were suffering from withdrawals. And she and the other nurses she worked with trained regularly in self-defense, because you just never knew what was going to happen in the ER. You needed to be ready to slip chokeholds and defend yourself. And so here Sue was staring down this intruder in her house with 30 years of preparation for this moment. And so Sue ran at this guy faster than he was coming at her, and it caught him off guard. She figured if she could just get up close to him, the power of the hammer strikes would be less. And so she rams into him, and she's about 5'5" and significantly outweighed him. He's about 5'9", maybe 200 pounds. And so she rams him into the wall. He hits her in the head once with the hammer, but it wasn't enough to subdue her or even knock her down. She barely felt it. And so she's holding on to him and she's screaming at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" Because there was a part of her that thought, this is a burglary. I'll just give you what you want. But the guy didn't say anything. And so Susan grabbed him and pushed even harder against the wall. And the man would say 2 words. It was the only 2 words he said the entire time. And it was, "You're strong." And Susan, when she heard that, it was like an adrenaline rush. She knew this guy was not trying to rob her. He was just trying to kill her. And she thought, no, I'm gonna live. And she managed to wrestle the hammer away from him while pinning him against the wall, and then smashed him in the head 3 times with this hammer before he managed to get it back. But when he reached for the hammer, she grabbed his throat and began choking the life out of him. The man immediately went for his throat to get her hand off of him, so he was not trying to attack her. And Susan realized that she had him on the defensive, and she grabbed tighter and tighter around his throat. She moved her other hand up and really started crushing his windpipe. And then she screamed at him, "I'll call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you." And the man looked at her and just grunted at her. And so she continued to squeeze harder and harder until his face turned purple and his eyes rolled back. And she knew as an emergency room nurse, if she continued, she would kill him. And she wasn't really prepared to do that. And so she threw him to the ground. She turned and began to run towards the front door. But this guy jumped up and leapt after her, grabbed her by the ankle, and tripped her to the ground. When she landed, she rolled over onto her back, and right on top of her is this guy wielding the hammer, and he's about to bring it down on her. And so she instinctively just shot up. She sat up as fast as she could, and she bit down as hard as she could on the inner part of his upper leg. She bit so hard she tore through the fabric. And the guy screamed out in pain. He couldn't even hit her with the hammer. He began staggering back, at which point she released the bite, got up onto a knee, and then then bit him again on the side of his rib cage as hard as she could, once again tearing through the fabric. And so now this guy is howling at the top of his lungs, at which point Sue grabs him and throws him to the ground, but she falls with him and she lands directly behind his back. And he's still trying to grab her and he's got the hammer and he's trying to hit her. And so she reaches out and puts her arm over his throat and puts him in a wicked chokehold, one that he was not getting out of. And so the guy is trying to fight and get his neck out of the chokehold, but Susan decided that this guy, he's not going to talk, he's not going to tell me what he wants, he's here to kill me, so I'm going to kill him first. And she proceeded to choke him to death. And once he stopped moving, she calmly stood up, looked down, knew he was dead. She grabbed his hammer and then calmly walked out the front door, walked to her neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and then her neighbor comes up and sees Sue just standing there with her clothes tattered and she's all bruised and bloodied, but she looks like she's totally okay. And the neighbor asks Sue, what are you doing? What's going on? Why do you have that hammer? And Sue would tell her that, well, I had an intruder and he tried to kill me, so I killed him. And I need to use your phone to call the police. And so her neighbor's like, okay, come on in and use my phone. And so Sue walks in with her hammer in hand and calmly calls the police and tells them what happened. Police and paramedics show up and they go inside of Sue's house and they confirm that her attacker was in fact dead. And her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey, who was a Vietnam veteran with a long rap sheet. They discovered Ed's backpack inside of Susan's house, and in it was a notebook that contained instructions for what to do after he killed Susan. And one of those instructions was to call Mike. It turns out this Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. And Mike, earlier in the day, had gone to the house and allowed Ed in and told him where to go and where to wait. And then on his way out, he had written that note saying, I'll see you in a couple of days. When police brought Mike in, he initially denied all charges and said he had nothing to do with this, but he would eventually confess and then would be sentenced to 7 years in prison for soliciting to murder his wife. Although Mike never gave his exact motivations for why he actually did this, he would have been ruined financially during this divorce, but if Susan were to die, he would inherit the house. Immediately after his sentencing, Susan sued Mike for $1 million, claiming she wanted to make sure he didn't have any more money so that he couldn't go hire another hitman to finish the job. Susan didn't have to worry for very long though, because Mike would die shortly thereafter in prison. As for Susan, she never faced any criminal charges and in fact was hailed as a hero in the wake of the attack. Richard Russell, better known as Bebo by his friends and family, was born in 1989 in Key West, Florida, but at the age of 7, he moved to Wasilla, Alaska. He was a standout athlete at Wasilla High School, competing in football and in track and field. After graduating in 2008, he moved to Coos Bay, Oregon, where he briefly attended a community college. While he was there, he met a woman named Hannah Strassner, and in 2011, they got married. And shortly after that, they opened a bakery that they would run together for 3 years. Hannah, who had gone to culinary school, was very detail-oriented and ran the show at the bakery. Bebo, on the other hand, was not professionally trained and was much more laid back and interested in experimenting with new and wild recipes. In 2015, with heavy hearts, they decided to sell the bakery so they could move to Seattle and be closer to Hannah's family. Once they arrived there, Bebo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. After working at Horizons Air for 4 years as a ramper, someone that moves the luggage in and out of the aircraft, Bebo was given some additional responsibility. They asked him to be on a 2-person tow team. A tow team is in charge of moving airplanes around in between their flights. And so the way this works is one person goes down and drives the actual tow vehicle and hooks that up to the airplane and begins moving it around, and the other person would go up into the cockpit, turn the plane on, and then work a couple of very basic systems to help get the plane to go where it needs to go. The members of a tow team are one of the very few number of people that are allowed to go into the cockpit of an aircraft by themselves. And so Bebo really relished this opportunity, and when he was up there, he found himself fascinated with all the controls, and any chance he got, he would ask a pilot if they were inside of the aircraft to teach him what some of these controls were. But one time, Bebo was flipping some of the switches in the cockpit that he was not supposed to touch that other pilots had told him about, and the pilot of this particular plane caught him doing it, took exception to it, and reported him. But surprisingly, there were no repercussions. It was just really embarrassing for Bebo. Like many of the other ground service agents working at Horizon Airlines, Bebo was generally unhappy with his job. He felt like it was boring, that there wasn't much upward mobility, and that he was criminally underpaid. But there was one redeeming quality of his job, and that was, in virtue of working for an airline, he got all sorts of free airfare. And so not only did he get to fly for free all over the world, he got to fly basically anytime he wanted up to Alaska to visit his hometown and see his family, something that was very important to him. The people that knew Bibo said he had a great sense of humor, he was extremely friendly, and you could always catch him with his head buried in a book. And his coworkers would say he had aspirations to be an officer in the military. And when all those people that knew Bibo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did on August 10th, 2018? None of them have an answer. On that fateful day at 1:35 p.m. local time, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac Airport where Bibo worked. And so this plane was not scheduled to fly for the rest of the day, so it was taxied to the far north section of the airport to a parking spot called Cargo 1. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Bibo arrived at Cargo 1 and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. He hopped out of the plane, got in his tow vehicle, and used it to turn the plane around so its nose was pointed towards the airfield. He moved the tow vehicle out of the way and then climbed back inside the aircraft, shut it behind him, and got in the cockpit and began taxiing out towards the runway. For the next few minutes, air traffic control bombarded Bibo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bibo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games and fiddling with some switches in the cockpit while he was in the tow team, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1 hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. Onlookers on the ground were shocked to see this passenger airline performing these ridiculous stunts so low to the ground that all over Seattle, you had people filming this plane and posting it to social media. So in real time, it was like the world was made aware of Bibo up in the sky. And so people went outside and just watched as he flew around. But the real story is not the aerial stunts that Bibo was pulling in the sky. It was the strange, calm conversation that Bibo had with the air traffic controller the whole time he was up in the sky. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bibo that he really needs to come down and land this aircraft. And he begins telling him where he can go, different airfields, and if he needs to, he can land out in the Puget Sound. But Bibo kind of laughs it off and says, "You know, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane. I just wanted to do a couple maneuvers before I put it down." And so as Bibo soared through the sky, this controller tries in vain to convince Bibo to stop what he's doing. And Bibo's just completely ignoring him and cracking jokes with him and telling him how he just loves the scenery up there and how beautiful it is. And then at one point, Bibo becomes remorseful and he says to the controller that he really hopes he hasn't ruined his day and he feels really bad for the people that he's inevitably going to hurt. And then in Bibo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy and he's got a couple of screws loose and he didn't know it until now. Towards the end of the flight, Bibo tells the controller that he's going to try for one more barrel roll, and if it goes well, he's going to go nose down and call it a night. The controller tries to convince him that it's still possible to try to land, but at this point, Bibo's not listening. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bibo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. Here is a condensed version of some of the commentary between Bibo and the air traffic controller, along with some of the real footage of him flying the plane.
I just kind of want to do a couple maneuvers, see what it can do before I put her down, you know?
Approach welcome, final runway 16 right.
Welcome. Man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is.
There is the runway just off your right side in about a mile. Do you see that?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it. I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. I think I'm gonna try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, I'll just go nose down and call it a night.
How Bibo was able to take off and fly around and pull these stunts without any formal training remains a mystery. Some people believe he was planning this for a long time, which is why whenever he was in the cockpit, when he was in the tow team, he would ask pilots to explain the different switches and toggles and how to use them, and he would feign that he was just curious, when in reality he was actually trying to learn how to fly the plane. As for the incredible stunts he was doing, it's believed he did learn those in a video game. But even if this is true, that he learned how to fly a plane by asking a couple questions and playing video games, the chances of it working out and actually successfully taking off and doing what he did are astronomically low. Normal people can't do that. And that's why the internet gave Bibo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King.